Some people don't argue to solve anything. They argue to provoke movement. They interrupt to create friction. They criticize to generate reaction. They raise their voice not because the topic requires it, but because intensity gives them leverage. Difficult people thrive on emotional shifts. If they can make you irritated, defensive, flustered, or anxious, they've already changed the temperature of the interaction. And whoever controls the temperature controls the dynamic. Most people respond instinctively. A sharp comment is met with a sharper one. A passive-aggressive remark is met with a defensive explanation. A raised voice is matched with raised volume. And in that moment, the difficult person wins, not because they were right, but because they succeeded in moving you. Emotional movement is their reward. It confirms influence. It confirms impact. It confirms that they can steer the exchange. What makes this even more subtle is that difficult behavior often disguises itself as honesty or passion. I'm just being direct. I'm just telling the truth. You're too sensitive. These phrases shift responsibility. Suddenly you're not responding to the original comment, you're defending your reaction. The conversation drifts away from substance and into emotion, and once that shift happens, clarity dissolves. The Stoics understood something powerful about human conflict. You cannot control another person's behavior, but you can control the emotional climate you bring into the room. If someone is chaotic and you match their chaos, the environment escalates. If someone is intense and you match their intensity, the conflict deepens. But if someone is chaotic and you remain calm, the contrast destabilizes them. Calm is disruptive to emotional manipulation. Calm is uncomfortable for someone expecting friction. Think about it clearly. When someone attempts to provoke you and you don't react immediately, there's a gap. That gap creates uncertainty. They expected resistance. They expected pushback. They expected visible irritation. Instead, they get composure, and composure interrupts their rhythm. Over the next several segments, I'm going to give you 6 calm responses that neutralize difficult behavior instantly. Not through aggression, not through sarcasm, not through dominance, but through structure and emotional control. These responses don't escalate conflict, they collapse it, because when you control your temperature, you control the exchange. And once you learn to stay steady while others spike, you stop being easy to move. Before we get into the specific responses, you need the right frame. Because if you try to use calm words with reactive energy underneath, it won't work. People feel incongruence immediately. The power is not in the phrase. It's in the temperature you bring with it. The Stoic frame is simple. You do not control their behavior, but you control the emotional climate you contribute. And emotional climate determines direction. Difficult people often try to pull you into their tempo. They speed things up. They increase intensity. They exaggerate tone. They introduce sarcasm. They layer emotion onto the exchange until the conversation is no longer about content, it's about control. If you match, because whoever becomes reactive first loses leverage. Marcus Aurelius wrote constantly about governing impressions. An impression is the first emotional hit you feel when someone says something provocative. It's that flash of irritation, that urge to interrupt, that need to correct immediately. Most people obey that impression instantly. Stoic discipline teaches you to pause, to observe the reaction before acting on it. That pause is control, and control changes everything. When you don't escalate, the difficult person has 2 options: escalate alone or recalibrate. And escalating alone often makes them look unstable. That's why calm is disruptive. It forces imbalance to reveal itself. There's another layer here. Difficult people often rely on emotional contagion. They raise tension so you absorb it. Once you absorb it, the environment becomes chaotic, and chaos favors the loudest voice. But if you refuse to absorb it, if you stay measured, the contagion fails. You become a stabilizing force instead of an amplifier. That stabilization shifts perception in the room. Observers start to see who is controlled and who is not, and perception determines authority. Remember this clearly: you are not responsible for managing their emotions. You are responsible for managing yours. If someone becomes aggressive and you stay calm, that contrast speaks louder than any comeback. It communicates strength without aggression. It communicates boundaries without hostility. It communicates confidence without performance. Over the next responses, you'll notice a pattern. None of them attack. None of them defend excessively. None of them try to overpower. They simply refuse to participate in emotional escalation. And when you consistently refuse escalation, difficult behavior loses its traction. Because traction requires friction, and calm removes friction. Response number 1. That's your perspective. Simple, neutral, complete. When someone makes a provocative statement, most people instinctively move to defend themselves. They correct the facts. They justify their reasoning. They counterattack. But the moment you defend emotionally, you've accepted the frame. You've stepped into their arena. And now you're reacting instead of leading. That's your perspective does something different. It acknowledges without agreeing. It responds without escalating. It refuses to argue over interpretation. And most importantly, it separates identity from opinion. Difficult people often blur those lines. They present opinions as facts. They speak with certainty to create pressure. They imply that disagreement equals incompetence. When you say, "That's your perspective," you calmly return ownership. You're not saying they're wrong. You're not saying they're right. You're saying their view belongs to them. That shift is powerful because it stops the argument from expanding. There's no defense to attack, no explanation to dissect, no emotional spike to feed on. Imagine someone says, "You clearly don't know what you're doing." The reactive response would be, "That's not true. I've been doing this for years. Now you're explaining. Now you're justifying. Now you're inside the frame." But if you say calmly, "That's your perspective," and pause, the energy changes. The tension doesn't escalate. The spotlight shifts back to them. They either double down alone or soften, but you remain steady. The key here is tone. It must be calm, not sarcastic, not dismissive, not irritated, just neutral. Because neutrality communicates confidence. It signals that their statement did not destabilize you. And when someone realizes their attempt to provoke didn't land, the power dynamic shifts slightly in your favor. This response also protects you psychologically. You don't internalize every criticism. You don't absorb every projection. You recognize that people speak from their own experiences, biases, insecurities, and interpretations. And you don't need to dismantle each one publicly. The Stoics understood this deeply. They believed that other people's judgments are not facts about you. They are reflections of their perception. Once you separate yourself from those judgments, they lose weight. That's your perspective is not avoidance. It's clarity. It draws a boundary around your internal world. It says, "I hear you, but I'm not required to adopt your lens." And that calm separation destabilizes conflict faster than confrontation ever could. Response number 2. Let's stick to the point. Difficult people often derail conversations on purpose. They introduce side comments. They bring up unrelated past issues. They exaggerate tone. They shift from the topic to your character. Once the conversation moves from content to emotion, clarity disappears. And when clarity disappears, chaos wins. Let's stick to the point quietly reclaims structure. It doesn't accuse. It doesn't insult. It doesn't escalate. It simply narrows the frame. When someone says, "You always do this," you never listen, the emotional trap is obvious. If you defend yourself, "That's not true. I always listen," you're now arguing history. You're inside their narrative. But if you calmly respond, "Let's stick to the specific issue," right now you redirect the energy back to substance. Structure is stabilizing. Emotional escalation is destabilizing. Difficult personalities rely on destabilization. When you reintroduce structure, you remove their advantage. This works because most chaotic exchanges thrive on diffusion. The moment the discussion becomes scattered past events, exaggerated claims, personal jabs, the original topic disappears. And when the topic disappears, resolution becomes impossible. By saying, "Let's stick to the point," you reduce surface area. You limit the battlefield. You force the conversation back into clarity. Tone matters again. It must be measured, not sharp, not impatient, just firm. You are not shutting someone down. You are narrowing the scope. The Stoics valued focus. They believed that clarity of thought protects clarity of action. When conversations drift into emotional fog, decision-making deteriorates. Authority restores focus. There is also a subtle psychological shift here. When you redirect calmly, you signal that you will not be pulled into emotional chaos. You're not denying their feelings. You're simply refusing to let feelings replace structure. Over time, people learn something about you. Attempts to derail won't work. Side attacks won't expand. Emotional exaggeration won't gain traction. And when someone realizes that chaos doesn't destabilize you, they either adjust their approach or exhaust themselves trying. Either way, you remain steady. Structure under pressure is authority in action. Response number 3, silence paired with steady eye contact. This is the midpoint shift, because sometimes the most destabilizing response is no verbal response at all. Difficult people often expect friction. They expect you to defend, to argue, to react. Even if they pretend they don't, their behavior is designed to trigger movement. And when you remove that movement entirely, you interrupt the pattern. Imagine someone makes a sarcastic remark in front of others. You finally decided to show up on time, huh? Most people respond instantly. They laugh nervously. They defend. They fire back. The room fills with noise. The moment passes. But if instead you look at them calmly, hold eye contact for a second longer than expected and say nothing, something shifts. Silence introduces weight. That weight creates discomfort. And now, the discomfort sits with them. Silence works because it transfers pressure. Words relieve pressure. Reaction relieves pressure. When you stay silent, you allow the emotional tension to hang in the air. And in that space, observers start to register what just happened. If the comment was inappropriate, silence makes it visible. If the remark was passive-aggressive, silence exposes it. If the tone was hostile, silence amplifies it. You don't need to call it out. The pause does the work. The Stoics practiced restraint deliberately. They believed not every impulse required expression. Not every challenge required response. Sometimes, composure is the response. The key here is posture and presence. Silence without steadiness feels awkward. Silence with composure feels intentional. Your shoulders stay relaxed, your face neutral, your gaze steady, not aggressive, not staring, just grounded. That combination communicates something powerful. You are not rattled. You are not scrambling. You are not playing. In many cases, the difficult person will fill the silence themselves. They'll soften the comment. They'll laugh it off. They'll clarify. They'll backtrack. Because silence forces self-awareness. And self-awareness is uncomfortable for someone who was expecting reaction. This response isn't about intimidation. It's about non-participation. You are refusing to energize behavior that doesn't deserve it. Over time, people learn that provoking you results in emptiness, not explosion. And emptiness is unsatisfying for someone seeking control. Silence, when controlled, is one of the strongest signals of internal power. Response number 4. I'm not engaging in that. Clear, calm, final. There are moments when redirection isn't enough, when silence isn't appropriate, when someone is clearly trying to pull you into a personal attack, gossip cycle, or emotional spiral. In those moments, you don't debate the content. You address the behavior. I'm not engaging in that. Notice what this does. It doesn't accuse them of being toxic. It doesn't call them immature. It doesn't analyze their motives. It simply withdraws participation. Participation is the oxygen of escalation. When you remove participation, escalation collapses. Most people, when faced with a personal jab, respond by defending themselves. That's not fair. You misunderstood me. That's not what happened. And suddenly the exchange expands. Emotion rises. Volume increases. The conflict becomes mutual. But when you calmly say, "I'm not engaging in that," you shift the dynamic entirely. You're not arguing the point. You're refusing the format. The Stoics believed that you always retain control over your own conduct. No one can force you to participate in something beneath your standards. That is internal sovereignty. This response signals sovereignty. It communicates, "I see what's happening, and I'm choosing not to step into it." Tone matters again. It must be even, not sharp, not irritated, no sarcasm, just firm neutrality. Because if you sound angry, you're still emotionally inside the exchange. But if you sound grounded, you appear above it. There's also a reputational layer here. In group settings, observers immediately recognize composure versus reactivity. When one person escalates and the other declines calmly, the contrast is obvious. Authority shifts quietly toward the composed individual. "I'm not engaging in that" is powerful because it closes the door without slamming it. It ends the cycle without fueling it. And over time, people learn something about you. Attempts to drag you into emotional chaos will fail. That predictability changes behavior. Because when provocation produces nothing but calm refusal, it stops being rewarding. Response number 5. The delayed answer. Most difficult people rely on urgency. They push for immediate reaction. They demand instant clarity. They corner you with loaded questions designed to force you into a quick emotional response. The speed is intentional. When you answer too quickly, you answer from impulse, and impulse is easy to manipulate. The delayed answer disrupts that rhythm. Instead of responding immediately, you pause, you breathe. You say something simple like, "Let me think about that," or "I'll get back to you," and then you stop. That pause communicates control. When someone pressures you, "So, what are you going to do about it?" the instinct is to defend your position instantly, to prove you're decisive, to avoid looking uncertain. But immediate answers often come from ego, not clarity. The Stoics practiced deliberate response. They believed that wisdom requires reflection, not because they were slow thinkers, but because they refused to be rushed into poor decisions by emotional force. The delayed answer accomplishes several things at once. First, it lowers the emotional temperature. Urgency fades when time enters the equation. Second, it prevents you from being cornered. Many manipulative exchanges rely on speed. If you slow the exchange, the pressure weakens. Third, it shifts power subtly. The person pushing for immediate reaction loses momentum. They have to wait, and waiting removes leverage. There's also psychological strength in comfort with silence. When you say, "I'll think about it," and you don't over-explain, you demonstrate confidence. You're not scrambling to prove competence. You're choosing clarity over speed. Difficult people often interpret hesitation as weakness, but controlled delay is not hesitation. It's discipline. In fact, people who rush responses often regret them. People who pause rarely do. The key is consistency. Your tone remains steady. Your body language remains relaxed. You're not avoiding. You're not defensive. You're simply choosing not to operate at someone else's tempo. Over time, others adjust. They learn that they cannot rush you into reaction. They cannot pressure you into commitment. They cannot extract emotion on demand. And once urgency no longer controls you, manipulation loses its foothold. Control your pace, and you control the exchange. Response number 6. The strategic exit. Not every interaction deserves endurance. Not every conversation deserves completion. And not every difficult person deserves unlimited access to your energy. Sometimes the strongest move is not a phrase, it's a decision. You leave, calmly, without announcement, without drama. The strategic exit is not avoidance, it's boundary enforcement through action. When someone refuses to regulate themselves, when they continue escalating, repeating attacks, circling the same hostility, you don't stay to win. You don't stay to prove. You don't stay to dominate. You remove yourself. You might say, "We can continue this later," or "I'm stepping away from this conversation," or simply, "I'll talk to you when things are calmer." Then you disengage. What makes this powerful is the absence of emotional charge. No slammed doors, no final insult, no visible frustration, just clarity and departure. Difficult personalities often escalate because they assume you'll remain available for conflict. They assume they can drain the interaction until you explode or collapse. The strategic exit interrupts that pattern completely. It communicates something subtle, but decisive access to you is conditional. The Stoics practiced voluntary withdrawal from situations that threatened internal stability, not because they were weak, but because they understood something. Critical peace is preserved through selective engagement. If someone cannot operate within respectful boundaries, you are not obligated to stay present for their volatility. There's also a psychological shift here. When you leave calmly instead of escalating, the emotional energy remains with them. They don't get the explosion. They don't get the reaction. They're left alone with their own intensity, and intensity without resistance often collapses. The strategic exit protects your nervous system. It prevents unnecessary damage. It reinforces that you value your internal equilibrium more than winning a moment. Over time, people learn the pattern. Escalation leads to distance. Calm leads to access. And when access becomes earned rather than automatic, respect begins to follow. Walking away without anger is not weakness. It is composure with boundaries. Here's what ties all of this together. Difficult people are not powerful because they are loud. They are powerful because most people are reactive. Remove the reaction, and you remove the fuel. Every response we covered shares the same foundation: emotional regulation. That's your perspective. Let's stick to the point. Silence with steady presence. I'm not engaging in that. Delayed response. Strategic exit. None of these attack. None of these overpower. None of these attempt to humiliate. They simply refuse escalation. And refusal is disruptive. When you stay calm while someone is trying to provoke you, the contrast becomes visible. Observers notice who is stable and who is unstable. Stability attracts authority. Instability repels it. The Stoics never aimed to dominate others. They aimed to govern themselves. And in doing so, they often became the most influential presence in the room. Because composure under pressure signals strength more clearly than aggression ever could. When you control your temperature, you control the dynamic. When you control the dynamic, you control the outcome. And when you consistently operate from calm instead of impulse, difficult behavior begins to reorganize around you. Some people will adjust. Some will distance themselves. Either result protects your peace. Remember this clearly. You are not responsible for managing someone else's volatility. You are responsible for maintaining your own stability. And stability is leverage. It lowers tension. It exposes manipulation. It neutralizes chaos. Over time, people stop testing those who cannot be moved easily. They stop escalating around those who do not amplify. They stop pushing where there is no emotional yield. That is the quiet shift. Not dominance, not revenge, not intimidation, just disciplined composure repeated consistently. And that consistency builds something rare: psychological gravity. If this resonated, drop a comment below. Calm is my leverage. Stay with this series because presence is not performance. It is practice. And the more you practice controlling your internal state, the less external behavior will ever control you.